Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Daily Faded, where we get faded daily and talk about the politics and news of the day. I hope you'll join me by smoking some bud or having a drink or doing whatever it is you like to do. Today is June 22nd, 2020. God, this year has gone by slow and fast all at the same time. Trump wants more American carnage. We're going to get into that a little bit later on. First, our COVID update. There was over 9.1 million confirmed cases around the globe and over 474,000 deaths. On Sunday, yesterday, the World Health Organization reported the largest one-day increase in infections across the globe. It said that there were 183,020 new cases, with Brazil and the United States accounting for the most new infections. In the U.S., we have 2.388153, 2.3 million infections, and 122,610 deaths, people who have died from COVID-19. In California, we had our highest caseload yesterday since March, with 4,515 new cases, which brings us to up over 184,000 cases in California and 5,565 deaths. I came across something as I was reading Naomi Klein that I thought I would drop into the show because it kind of relates a little bit to everything that's going on. This is from On Fire, the burning case for a Green New Deal. Quote, "The most important lesson to take from the climate change issue is that there is no way to confront the climate crisis as a technocratic problem in isolation. It must be seen in the context of austerity and privatization, of colonialism and militarism, and of all the various systems of othering needed to sustain them all. The connections and intersections between them are glaring, and yet so often resistance to them is highly compartmentalized. The anti-austerity people rarely talk about climate change. The climate change people rarely talk about war or occupation. Too many of us fail to make the connection between the guns that take Black lives on the streets of U.S. cities and in police custody and the much larger forces that annihilate so many Black lives on arid land and in precarious boats around the world." So basically, she's making a point of maintaining intersectionalism as we do the work of the leftist project. And we're seeing very clear ways in which that's happening as we see rallies for Black trans rights, and we see rallies for Black disabled rights. Anyway, I just wanted to read that quote because I thought that was interesting. DACA was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. Chief Justice wrote, "We do not decide whether DACA or its rescission are sound policies. We address only whether the agency complied with the procedural requirement that it provide a reasoned explanation for its action." They went before the Supreme Court and they didn't have a reasoned explanation for their action. Like, I would think in preparing for the Supreme Court, I would think that coming up with an explanation for why I'm in front of the Supreme Court, I would think that would be, like, as a lawyer, like the thing to do. But what do I know? I'm just a stoner in Los Angeles. They also refused to hear a case on police qualified immunity, leaving in place a district judge decision that overturns it. Now, the House is likely to pass a bill calling for DC statehood, which I massively support and which will go nowhere in the Senate. And the best quote on this from Trump is that Republicans would be crazy to vote for it, quote, so we can have 2 more Democrat senators and 5 more congressmen. No, thank you. That'll never happen, Trump told the New York Post last month. Okay, so first off, it would have 1 representative. Any of the maybe Puerto Rico might have more than 1 representative, but any other place in America that might get statehood would only have 1 representative, like Delaware or Wyoming. My legs are getting caught in spider webs. I don't know why. Look, there are certain rights that every American citizen gets as a result of the 10th Amendment. And those rights are the rights that are guaranteed to the states. So things like having a health department, which is not contemplated in the Constitution, the rights of the state health department to do things like stay-at-home orders, the federal government doesn't have the right to do that. That right is reserved to the states. The 10th Amendment says all rights not enumerated in the Constitution are reserved for the states. Which means, and of course, we have the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection under the laws. However, if you have a group of American citizens who don't have statehood, then that is a group of American citizens who are being denied the rights that citizens who have statehood have. So I'm a strong believer that there should be no one living in the United States who doesn't live in a state. And I think we should have new states. I think DC should become a state, but then we should have new states after binding votes by the local population. Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands should be a state. American Samoa should be a state. American Virgin Islands should be a state. And Puerto Rico should either be a state or an independent nation, depending on a binding vote by the population of Puerto Rico. And he really is an idiot with this 5 new representatives thing. You know, I was having trouble with lighters. Look at this fancy design on this lighter. Oh, by the way, I'm so sorry about not streaming most of last week. I was in back agony. I had a procedure, an outpatient procedure done on my back on Wednesday, and I just couldn't sit here in this seat. So anyway, so moving on. I'm sure you've heard this, but it's something I wanted to touch on. The Aunt Jemima brand will get a new name and a new image along with Uncle Ben and Mrs. Butterfield. Can we rename the Redskins already? Think about this. It's 2020, and think of all the things we have or don't have. It's 2020, and we still have Aunt Jemima. It's 2020, and we still have the Redskins and the Chiefs and the Indians. It's 2020, and we still have no federal law against lynching. It's 2020, and we still have cops killing unarmed black men. It's 2020, and we're still not doing anything substantial about climate change. And, you know, it's 2020, and our main religion of capitalism hasn't solved problems like healthcare, housing, or jobs, or inequality. That's just a fraction of the list. But getting back to Aunt Jemima, why not rebrand Aunt Jemima's pancake mix and syrup as Nancy Green's famous pancake mix, and syrup. Consider this from NPR. According to a 1923 obituary in the Chicago Defender, Nancy Green was born into slavery in Montgomery. Nancy Green is the woman on whose image Aunt Jemima was created. According to a 1923 obituary in the Chicago Defender, Nancy Green was born into slavery in Montgomery, Kentucky in 1834 and moved to Chicago to serve as a nurse and caretaker for the prominent Walker family. Several obituaries, including one Williams found in the Sunday Morning Star, claim it was Green who originally came up with the pancake recipe that would go on to be sold as Aunt Jemima mix. According to the obit, Green made pancakes for the Walker brothers, who then spread the word of Green's legendary pancakes among their friends. Eventually, word reached executives of the Aunt Jemima Manufacturing Company, who ultimately hired Green to make pancakes and portray Aunt Jemima at the 1893 World Fair. Green was a philanthropist and ministry leader. She was one of the founding members of the Olivet Baptist Church, the oldest active Black Baptist church in Chicago. So why not let the image of the woman who was born into slavery but moved to Chicago and led an inspiring life, why not let that be the image of the brand? Obviously, you have to come up with an image of her that is not a terrible racial stereotype. But perhaps there are some pictures of her to work with. PepsiCo, which owns the Aunt Jemima brand ultimately, has already been sued unsuccessfully once for remuneration for Nancy Green's family. They did not. That case was actually. They did not win that case. But I think PepsiCo should remunerate them now and pay them a license fee going forward for her name and likeness, or buy it out, or whatever the deal would be. I don't know how those deals work. But these corporations have to put their money where their mouth is. And this is the kind of move that I think would really do more than just change the name of the brand, more than just make a statement about racial equality, actually take a step towards correcting something that is historically cultural appropriation and racist and everything. So I don't know if I'm missing something here because I'm a white person. Please let me know. So this was from last week. This is something I wanted to report on last week. The International Business Times, which is a great source of news. David Sirota, he used to work for Bernie Sanders, actually wrote for the International Business Times before he went on to work for Bernie. George Floyd's brother calls on United Nations to address systemic racism, police brutality in U.S. The brother of George Floyd appeared before the United Nations Human Rights Council on Wednesday, calling on the body to investigate systemic racism and police brutality in the United States. Quote, "The way you saw my brother tortured and murdered on camera is the way Black people are treated by police in America," Philonise Floyd said during his call to Geneva. "I hope that you will consider establishing an independent commission of inquiry to investigate police killings of Black people in America and the violence used against peaceful protesters." Wednesday's meeting was at the request of several African countries, also asking the Council to seek ways of combating systemic racism and police brutality. The country's proposal asks UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet to gather evidence of systemic racism and police brutality over the next year and report back with the findings in June 2021. The tragic events of 25th May in Minneapolis in the United States, which led to the death of George Floyd, led to protests throughout the world against injustice and police brutality that persons of African descent face on a daily basis in many regions of the world. Someone said, whose name I cannot pronounce, on Monday. The death of George Floyd is unfortunately not an isolated incident. Early drafts of the proposal allegedly named the U.S., but officials lobbied the African countries to remove the U.S. from it and tone down its language somewhat. The U.S. pulled out of the council 2 years ago and hasn't attended a meeting since. So the United States dropped off the Human Rights Commission 2 years ago. That was a terrible idea at the time, and it's still a terrible idea because we want to be a country that is pro-human rights, even if we violate human rights. But that's how bad it's become in the United States, that there are international outcries around the world trying to help Americans deal with the oppression of the American system of governance, the American systemic problems. So I just think it's really notable. And there's real solidarity from a lot of protesters and activists around the world. So that's a really great thing. This is an interesting story. The New York Times reports that publicly available data from 3 places, New Orleans, Sacramento, and Montgomery County, Maryland, show the percentage of different types of calls that their cops respond to. There are a few different categories, but responding to non-criminal calls is the biggest category for all 3, 37, 32, and 37 respectively. In all 3 areas, violent crime was only 4% of their calls. So violent crime is only 4% of their calls. Can't everything else be done without a gun? Can't everything else be done without a taser, without the threat of violence? I would like to think in a civilized society it could. We need bobbies in the U.S., like the English guys with the nightstick and no gun. That's what we need. There was a tear gas story from Democracy Now! That I want to talk about because the use of tear gas is really out of control. Nearly 100 law enforcement agencies have used tear gas against protesters since the killing of George Floyd. Amnesty International published a new report called Tear Gas: An Investigation. Found the misuse of tear gas worldwide has resulted in severe injuries and death. Brian Kastner of Amnesty International said the broad trend of tear gas being used quickly and wrongly, many of the worst ways to use tear gas, which we used to see around the world, but not in the US, is using tear gas in a confined space. Hong Kong, Seattle, and Philly. Tear gas grenades are being fired straight at people's heads, which killed dozens of people in Baghdad last year. In the US, it hasn't killed anyone yet, in part because the tear gas grenades in Iraq are heavier than the ones being used domestically. It's all over. Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Iowa City, Iowa. Most tear gas used against protesters has been U.S. made, privately held companies. No shareholders to report to. Don't make public the exact ingredients. No transparency. The dosage of CS gas itself is kept secret. Same with other ingredients in it like silicon and other chemicals that make the CS burn. They are not disclosed. They need layers of non-reporting to make their work palatable because they know their product is dangerous and can be lethal. Tear gas is largely unregulated as a business. Even though it's banned in war, there are very few international rules about trading tear gas. It's a non-essential tool for police. Countries like the UK and Germany and some cities like Seattle have banned it successfully and found other methods of dealing with crimes. I've said many times that American capitalism is a death cult. And this is a perfect example. What about the companies that make the pepper ball guns that shot people, that shot protesters, that shot journalists like Adolfo Guzman Lopez? The pepper balls either have pepper or tear gas inside them, and these cops have been very, very quick to go to the pepper balls over and over again. So the other thing about this is that tear gas is a big business for certain privately held companies that most of us have never heard of. And that means people are getting rich off of peaceful protesters being tear gassed. That is a death cult economy. So the main story tonight, I thought there was an amazing article in Vanity Fair today by Jeff Sharlet. And I wanted to talk about this article because everybody from Kyle Kalinske to Seth Meyers was making fun of Trump today because he only had 6,200 people show up after supposed million RSVPs. Thank you, TikTok and K-pop fans. But he gave a particularly vicious speech, and it's not just jokes. So this article in Vanity Fair is called "You Know What to Do: Decoding the Grotesque Symbolism of Trump's Tulsa Rally" by Jeff Sharlet. Those who've never seen a Trump speech before remarked on what they took to be its incoherence. They didn't understand that for his followers, that's the appeal. It's a dual signal, simultaneously the official story and the vicious undertow. The economy, read boring, and comedy, racist, or just mean, kung flu, like the imitation of a CNN reporter with which, flagging a bit at 12 minutes in, he revved up the proceedings. From there on, he took what he wanted from the teleprompter, but he didn't look back once at even his own authoritarian sense of decorum. Trump usually tiptoes up to the QAnon conspiracy theories, undergirding his base's faith in the chosen one. Saturday night, he went romping through them. There was the rape fantasy that's an old standby of racist authoritarianism. Quote, "Hey, it's 1 o'clock in the morning and I've used the word on occasion, hombre. A very tough hombre is breaking into the window of a young woman whose husband is away as a traveling salesman," end quote. A dark-skinned man, an undefended and implicitly white woman, her quote-unquote traveling salesman husband, perhaps a figure from the pornography of Trump's youth, unable to defend her. And there was the close cousin of such violently sexualized narratives, the slasher flick meant to horrify and enthrall, to titillate and enrage. They, the animals, he said, by which he meant the rapists, by which he meant the illegals, by which he meant MS-13, by which he's meant Mexicans, by all of which he's meant not white, quote, cut up a young woman. They cut up a young woman. This is a quote from Trump. They cut up a young woman and her friend, cut them up with a knife because it was more painful. Dead. Cut them up with a knife because it's more painful. It takes longer than shooting a gun. They cut them up. Until I started really reading the details of the speech, I didn't think I would do much more than comment on how pathetic the turnout was, and have some schadenfreude. But on the other hand, we cannot let some of the most vile Trumpaganda that we've seen in a long time go without comment. And as Jeff Sharlet eloquently outlined, there's an awful lot of terribleness coming out of Trump's mouth. Look at the violent imagery he's evoking. He's doubling down on American carnage, tripling down. What's amazing is that he said in his inaugural speech that he was the one who could save us from this American carnage. And yet it still seems that Mexicans are climbing into white women's houses and raping them, according to Trump. To go back to the article, one of the key moves of such horror movie mongering is claiming victimhood for those who fantasize about murder. They want to punish your thought, but not their violent crime. That's another quote. Thought crime may well be an anxiety for those whose heads are filled with images of men climbing through windows and women being cut up. But here it's twisted so that the one who imagines murder is really its victim. This is Trump playing to Q's notion of itself as 1984's everyman hero, Winston Smith, and appeal to the conspiracy theorists' ersatz intellectualism. The everyman, or the silent majority, as Trump put it in Tulsa, can only take so much of this abuse. Our people are not nearly as violent, Trump declared, making clear that the protesters, some of whom he speculated might be foreigners, are on the other side. But if they ever were, it would be a terrible, terrible day for the other side. That's another quote. That's what Q calls the storm and what sane people call civil war. We have become so accustomed to the maladies of Trump's heart and the maladies of Trump's speaking that it's easy to dismiss this as another stupid Trump speech. I can't claim to have seen every Trump speech in history, but this speech sounded much more devilish and much more dangerous than anything I remember him saying in 2016. So this was his campaign launch, and it's like he's saying Mexicans are rapists all over again, only he's doubling down and tripling down. And he's setting up an incredibly dangerous polarization of whites against blacks and protesters against the country. He's also failing in part because he's stealing Nixon's law and order thing. And in the late 60s and the early 70s, there were some violent, radical leftist groups. And do I think that they were handled well by the U.S. government? No, I don't. But there were a lot of protests against the war, and there were a lot of images on nightly news of chaos and what seemed to be anarchy. So his law and order message worked for more conservative Americans who wanted things to get back to normal. But in this case, we don't have a major crime problem. Crime continues to go down, except in certain cities. So, I don't know if people actually believe that Antifa, is some sort of mass terrorist organization, like Trump spouts, but the left wing of 2020 is not violent. So, and I don't think they appear violent. It's obvious that the Black Lives Matter protesters are nonviolent protesters. It's obvious that the police are the ones bringing the violence in these situations. So, I think what might have been good politics in 2016, again, remember, the law and order message was a late addition to his messaging. Most of his messaging was race baiting and economic messages like it being against free trade. So, but right now he's riding solely on law and order because everything else is a fucking wreck. So he doesn't have a choice. Now, this part is hard to read. Who is the enemy in this civil war? It's a secret one, of course. Trump's frequent claims Saturday night that Joe Biden is controlled by unnamed radical powers is straight out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, as filtered through QAnon. I've heard similar ideas from many of his supporters. Usually they say George Soros, sometimes the Rothschilds, sometimes they just make it plain and say Jews. And then there was this, Trump's biggest Q drop of the night, an escalation that should concern us all. Biden, he said, will, quote, subsidize late-term abortion and after-birth execution, end quote. After-birth execution. This is Pizzagate rhetoric straight from the president's mouth, a pillar conviction of QAnon, the remarkably widespread belief among his supporters that Democratic elites traffic children, ritually kill them, cue Protocols of the Elder of Zion again, and even eat them. The first time a Trumper told me Democratic elites practice cannibalism, I dismissed it as fringe. By perhaps the fourth or fifth time, I understood cannibalism to be part of the mythos, a minority belief within Trumpism, but a potent one that it validates as moderate, the belief that Clinton, Obama, Biden axis merely abuses children. Fox News is already and has been peddling this nonsense of afterbirth execution. They made this big deal out of Virginia's law, and it's bullshit. There's no Democrat in America who wants a law that makes it easy to murder your child immediately after they're born. And I have to tell you, I had twins who were born 8 weeks premature. One was very healthy, and the other one was not. She had 2 congenital heart defects, needed surgery about 3.5 months into her life, and it didn't work. And she was dying, and we had to decide to take her off the ECMO, which was keeping her alive. But there was no chance of her recovering. None. She was dying right before our eyes. And that was a difficult personal choice to have to make. So when they start peddling this conspiracy about parents killing their children, what they're doing is they're allowing parents whose children have been born in incredible desperation, incredibly sick, on life support, to make the unfortunate healthcare decisions that families have to make. And there should be no law against that. The insidiousness of this rhetoric is simply profound. So, with that cheerful last bit of news, I'm going to smoke one more time. And bid you a fond adieu. Thank you for watching. Thank you for my Patreon patrons. I can't do it without you. And come on back tomorrow night at 8 o'clock Pacific. I'm Hats. Peace out.